Now, I can officially say welcome. On behalf of the New Legacy Committee, the Love Your Body Week Committee, the Associated Students of Sierra College, the Puente Club, and the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, welcome to the C.S.H.E.S.S Higher Education Speaker Series today at Sierra College. All right. My name is Dr. Reyes Ortega, and today I'm happy to share good news with all of you. Throughout our nation, countless schools, colleges, universities, and communities are celebrating the life of Cesar Chavez. March 31st commemorates his birthday, and since the year 2000, California has designated this day as a state holiday. I'm also here to share with you that the Cesar Chavez family, through the Chavez Foundation, thanks all of you for the interest in the life, work, and ideals of Cesar Chavez. The family also thanks you for your interest in commemorating this event in honor of his name. 2 years ago, the C.S.H.E.S.S Higher Education Speaker Series offered a forum to help each of us understand the complex and historical issues of race in the United States. This topic centered on this very fundamental question: does an African American president mean an end to racism? A panel of esteemed professionals walked us through the complexities of race that continues to challenge our own perceptions of what it means to achieve equity. Last year, our speaker series gave us an insight to the inconsistencies of our biases and our conflicting notions about the push and pull factors of immigration with respect to families of undocumented workers of the United States. This year, I am pleased to welcome you to yet another educational opportunity, an opportunity to exercise those qualities that define individuals like Cesar Chavez, Mahatma Gandhi, and Dr. Martin Luther King. Qualities that value respect, civility, communication, and compromise. Many years ago, I found myself down a path that I had chosen, a path by which I was trained to defend and to protect. In one particular moment in time, I found myself with the responsibility to protect Cesar Chavez by getting between him and in harm's way should there be any unforeseen circumstances. After he delivered a wonderful speech to an enormous crowd, I and another escorted Cesar out of a side exit of the theater and down a walkway to his humble-looking beige and brown station wagon. And before he leaned over to enter the passenger seat, he turned around and we looked directly into each other's eyes, and he thanked me for taking care of him. He then gave me a huge abrazo, a hug, before he was finally driven away. If Cesar was alive today, I know he would be proud of Sierra College, of President Willie Duncan, our faculty, our managers, students, and staff for supporting an event of academic freedom in honor of his name and of his ideals. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderator, Professor of Sociology, Megan Seeley. Thank you, and muchas gracias.
Thank you, Reyes, and thank you for your partnership in helping to create this event. This event, not only is it a part of the C.S.H.E.S.S Higher Education Speaker Series, but it also comes during a week that is very near and dear to many of our hearts at Sierra College. This week is Love Your Body Week, and we spend that week exploring issues of the body politic. We look at issues from across the board about our bodies, male, female, all genders inclusive, looking at issues of health, politics, sexuality, education. We've had a whole week of phenomenal events, and I wanted to take a moment to thank the planning committee for helping host this event and hosting the week of Love Your Body Week for Sierra College 2012. I also want to thank the tremendous support that we've received from the Associated Students of Sierra College, from the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, from Puente Program, from the New Legacy Committee, and I want to thank all of you in the audience for coming and joining us for this discussion today, taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for what can prove to be a very controversial conversation. So thank you for being here. This forum is an educational event. It's designed to address the social and political issues that impact women's reproductive health. Though we began planning the event some time ago, women's health issues have become the center of much attention lately, with political elections and congressional considerations and a lot in the media. With this, we've seen a lot of controversy about women's health, and the conversation is often framed solely about abortion. But I want to caution us a little bit today, and I want to be very clear that the panel discussion today was never intended to be solely about abortion, nor was it intended to be a debate. We hope today to address a wide variety of women's reproductive health issues, and abortion will be discussed, but as one part of a much larger conversation. However, if you are interested in a debate about abortion, our campus will be hosting one later in April. As a woman who has benefited greatly from access to information about my body and about my reproductive health, as an educator dedicated to creating opportunities for dialogue and knowledge, and now as the mother of 2 young girls, I'm grateful for the willingness of our panelists to join us today and share their expertise. So let me introduce our esteemed guests. Senator Liz Figueroa, who now serves as the Vice President of Public Affairs for California Planned Parenthood Mar Monte. Elected to the California State Senate in 1998 and served 2 terms in the California State Assembly. She was the first Northern California Latina to be elected to the Assembly in the past century, and she was named Legislator of the Year by numerous organizations, including the March of Dimes, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Association of Retarded Citizens, Leadership California, and the California National Organization for Women. She served as a board member for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, Hispanic Community Affairs Council, Fremont Adult School Advisory Board, and the president of the Board of California Elected Women's Association for Education and Research. Please join me in welcoming Senator Liz Figueroa. And I will announce all of our panelists right now and then move on to our questions of the day. Shauna Heckert is the executive director of the California Women's Health Specialist. Shauna Heckert joined the Feminist Women's Health Center in 1976. At that time, there was no place to get an abortion, nowhere to get information about sexuality or birth control, no over-the-counter pregnancy test. The last 35 years have been an extensive series of challenges, opportunities, growth, and change. The Feminist Women's Health Centers has weathered a storm of opposition, including 4 clinic fire bombings, and grown from 1 clinic in Chico in 1976 to 4 clinic sites and 3 satellite clinics. Many programs have been added, including men's services, Adoption Choices of Northern California, reproductive health outreach and education, a speakers bureau, women's health and referral line, a women's health radio show, and a young women's leadership program. The clinics serve a 30-county area from Sacramento to the Oregon border and provide services for 35,000 people each year. Please join me in welcoming Shauna Heckert. Our next panelist is Lisa Akamoto. She's a professor of law at the University of California, Davis. She teaches bioethics, healthcare law, public health law, reproductive rights, law and policy, and marital property. Her research areas include reproductive and genetic technology uses, healthcare disparities, public health law. More specifically, she focuses on the ways that race and gender mediate access to and impacts biomedical technology use in healthcare. Her recent work addresses reproductive tourism, the ways in which the human gamete uses links of fertility and biotechnology industries, and the privatizing effects of informed consent. Professor Akamoto is a bioethics associate at the UC Davis Health System Bioethics Program and a faculty associate of the UC Davis Center for Science and Innovation Studies. Please join me. Our next panelist, Sharon O'Hara, is from our local area. She's the Vice President of the Nevada County Citizens for Choice. She graduated from San Jose State with a Master's of Arts in Education and taught almost 40 years in elementary education. Before reconnecting with her high school sweetheart and marrying him at Lake Wildwood in 2007, Sharon had an extensive volunteer career in Orange County with political and teachers associations and women's groups and community activism. She chaired the local Democratic Committee and the National Women's Political Caucus of Orange County. She served as the president of the American Association of University Women in Orange County and on many boards. She currently serves as the Public Policy Chair for AAUW Nevada County and is a member of BPUW, League of Women's Votos, and the Seroptimus International of Grass Valley. She volunteers for Friends of Hospice and Music in the Mountains. She's just concluded 3 years as president of the Citizens of Choice, a grassroots nonprofit pro-choice founded in 1989 in Nevada County. Please join me in welcoming Sharon. And last but certainly not least, we have Jan Flint Robinson joining us today. She's the Executive Director for Black Women for Wellness in Los Angeles. Jan Robinson is recognized for her commitment to Black women and girls' health issues and for her skill at collaborating across cultures and communities to champion common issues. She has an accomplished record at building consensus by engaging people's heads and hearts before moving forward to tackle the issue at hand. Jan Robinson participates in a number of local, statewide, and national coalitions and partnerships, including Merger Watch, an advocacy and monitoring group working towards ensuring continuation of women's health care services as religious hospitals take over secular ones, the Reproductive Justice Coalition of Los Angeles, and the Leadership Development in Interethnic Relationships, which bring together social justice and health advocates. Please join me in welcoming Jan. Okay, so let's get started with our event today. I have some questions that I will be posing to the panel. We've decided to leave them somewhat open in terms of who would like to respond to them because we have a wealth of expertise up here. I have a few ground rules I'd like to establish right up front. Again, I want to remind you all that this is not intended to be a debate. This is an opportunity for us to share information and engage in a dialogue. You all, as an audience, will have an opportunity to participate with that in our Q&A time towards the end of today. You should have received or been offered a 3x5 card as you were entering into the theater. Those will be collected, and I will look over those, or actually someone else will look over them and hand them to me, and I will do a Q&A period the final 20 minutes or so of today. I want to encourage you all and remind you all to be courteous and to be respectful of one another in the audience and also for the panelists up here. So let's get started. Our first question I thought would be a good way to start off this discussion. When you hear the phrase reproductive rights, people seem to think only about abortion. Why is this, and how has the social and political climate contributed to this misconception? Would you like to take that first?
Sure,
Thank you, Senator Figueroa.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you, Professor Shealy. Dr. Ortega, when he made the introduction of this program, it was like my introduction to what I wanted to say, because when I gave my first speech in public in Spanish, it was with C.C.H.E.S.S. And that speech was against Safeway when they were using pesticides with the growing of strawberries. And I was 23 years old, and I gave this speech, and he was holding my hand, and he said, "This is important for young women on the field, and it's all about reproductive justice." And that's when I first heard the voice and that message. That was when I understood that it encompassed so much about what we ate and our air and everything around us. Then when I went into the legislature, I realized that so many of the issues that I worked on were about reproductive justice. It was about a woman and how long she could stay in the hospital with her child. It was about a woman after having a mammogram, how long she could stay. It was fighting insurance companies for women's health rights. It was all about reproductive justice. So for me, going to Planned Parenthood as the VP, as people say to me, "Do you like working there?" And I go, "I love it," because it continues that voice and that passion about what we will do with our bodies as a woman. But not only that, as a grandmother of 2 little girls and 4 grandchildren, I think about the next generations, the kind of world they'll be living in, the kind of opportunities they will have, and the kinds of choices that will be before them. And I want to be a role model for them. And I thank you all for being here to educate yourselves more and more on these important issues so that we could give those examples and those role models to our family members and those in our communities.
Beautifully said. I also have deep roots in the reproductive rights movement, now more aptly put, reproductive justice. I think that when, before Roe v. Wade, many of us were becoming feminists and understanding the oppression as women. And when Roe v. Wade happened, it gave many an opportunity to start other women's health projects. Of course, abortion was a very big part of it, but not the only part, especially not for the feminist providers as we were. In Chico, California, not only was there no place to get birth control or an abortion, unless you were married, you could get birth control, there really wasn't any care for women that were poor, that were uninsured. You couldn't get prenatal care. Your prenatal care was showing up in an emergency room. Unfortunately, I'm not talking about something that's in history. This is still today. And I think very briefly what happened is that we became single issue because of the attacks on abortion. When I first started, if someone told me that I would have to know what a temporary restraining order is, or an injunction, or how to get an ordinance about protesting, I would have said, "You're crazy. I'm in women's health. I don't have to do any of that." But unfortunately, the times of the last 20 years have dictated what our work was going to do and how we were going to busy our time. So we were defined by the violence in our society, not by our choosing. And I think now we have less violence, but we still have the problems that confront us today. But I think we're a stronger movement now because of the wonderful work of the Women of Color Coalition, Sister Song, and the Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice have brought this back into the forefront, or maybe for the first time, to really talk about how women can be at the forefront of all issues, and that women-guided policies, women's guided care, and women-guided communities are really at the heart of social justice.
I can address. I think one of the reasons we say rights is because the media stole our language. And women of color began using the term reproductive justice because that's what we were seeking. We were looking at how do we bring our life into the decisions that we make. Because when we were talking about choice, many women of color had no choices. We were very limited in access. We were very limited with affordability. We were very limited in terms of cultural competency or appropriateness in the options that were offered to us. So we knew we needed something bigger than choice to even achieve choice. So that's where we came the term reproductive justice. We also talked about reproductive health and reproductive rights in terms of the frame we're looking at. When we're talking about reproductive rights and reproductive health, we're looking at the woman and her ability to make a decision and implement that decision. When we start talking about reproductive justice, we're looking at the society and the environment that creates a climate where women make decisions. So that's where we began using that term, reproductive justice, because we really wanted to look at how society influences the decisions that we make, how media influences the decisions, how the location of resources in terms of, is there a clinic, is there health care in our community, or do we have transportation issues, do we have child care issues, do we have how much it costs issues. So there's a bigger framework for reproductive justice, and some of that is because reproductive rights became a very narrow framework for empowering women to exercise all the options available to them to control their reproductive lives.
I'm going to jump in. Since you said rights, and I'm teaching future lawyers, I feel obligated to say something. So I start off, I spent most of my career, I've been teaching for over 20 years, writing about reproductive rights, or what Jan has just defined as reproductive justice issues. And a large part of my work is critiquing the narrowness of the notion of rights and the way that if you frame things primarily as a legal issue, you leave a lot out. So my first 3 pieces of scholarship about in the reproductive rights area were about forced cesareans. So the very recent and continuing practice of forcing women to undergo cesarean section deliveries against their will. The next piece that I wrote about was about the way that women are regulated with respect to their decisions about fertility and pregnancy. So women who have chosen to undergo pregnancy and yet are still sort of managed by societal norms with respect to how they act. And I think anybody here who's gone through sort of a visible pregnancy and had people come up and feel free to touch you and tell you what to eat and what not to eat knows exactly what I'm talking about. At the time, I was focused primarily on the practice of putting women in jail because they had used drugs or alcohol during their pregnancy. So those were the first 2 pieces. So I think certainly the abortion debate and the abortion laws and cases have shaped a great deal of the way we think about the broader understanding of what reproductive health and reproductive liberty is about. But it leaves a great deal out, and when you leave out those other issues, you leave out a lot of other women and men.
Well, I don't want to be left out, so here I am. I'm representing Citizens for Choice, which started in 1989 in rural Nevada County. And justice was something that was new to me. I was a 4th grade teacher, and I thought I knew about the issues around women's, everything about women's lives. But when I came to Nevada County and discovered the work that Citizens for Choice had been doing, it really opened my eyes, because when you're in a rural community, even though it's large and it even butts up against Lake Tahoe, that doesn't mean that there's anywhere to go, especially if you're uninsured or underinsured, or you're young and you don't want to tell your parents, and all of those issues. So as far as we're concerned, the fact that women stepped out in 1989 and said, we need to bring change to Western Nevada County was a huge learning curve for me as an older person, and one that you could take to heart as emerging leaders for now. That doesn't matter when you started, it's important to get started.
Thank you all. Thank you. And just to pause for a moment to remind you all to turn your cell phones off. I'm hearing a little bit. And also, I see some people standing in the back, and I do see some seats over on this side if you want to come around and grab a seat for your comfort and our safety. Okay, so the next question I have is about how the issues of race and ethnicity impact women's health. And that's a pretty broad question. We could look at politics, we could look at access, we could look at cultural biases. There's a number of ways that we can take this question, and I know that there are a few of you on the panel that, that in particular would like to address that. Perhaps, Ms. Robinson, you'd like to start.
Sure. I actually brought a slide that I wanted to show. I actually brought several slides, but we decided on one. So in January 2010, they started a billboard campaign targeting African American women in African American communities. The billboard at the top that said endangered species had a picture, well, it has a picture of a young black child, and it was 70 billboards put up on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Los Angeles 3 days before the parade. So the question becomes then, how does that influence how we access health, and what does that mean? So I believe the intent was to shame and guilt black women, to make them feel bad about the choices that they made and the context in which they made those choices. But I want to bring it to what's going on today in the news also. When we first saw that, we said, why are you comparing our children to animals? You know, are they blue whales? Are they owls? What does that mean? And today we're having that discussion very loud and protests very loud because of a shooting in Florida where someone actually did hunt down a young black man. So you can see how we were really looking at the wide picture of what does it mean to have reproductive justice? What is it saying to that black mother that her child can be killed and no one is held accountable or responsible for it? And then what does that mean when black women try to or attempt to access reproductive health, or they try to exercise their reproductive rights, and there is no justice for them, there's no access for them. And when they raise their children or manage to have children, then their children don't have access. There are a couple of more things that happen along with that in terms of, there's one that has a silhouette of Obama that says every 21 minutes a leader is aborted. So also, what message does this give to black women, or to any women at all, really, about how do you access services, how do you access care? The one with the little girl says the most dangerous place for an African American child is in the womb. So what message is that given to women, especially in terms of accessing care? How does that limit her choices? There's a term I think some of you all who are sociology majors might have heard called effective kinship. And that means that if something happens in the black community, many of us take on that responsibility. Doesn't happen as much for other cultures and other people, but in the black community, if something happens, a lot of times, if it happens to a black person or with a black person, we have that affective kinship. So then we feel that affective shame or that affective guilt or that affective oppression when trying to access care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I just want to expand a little bit or pick up on a little bit of what Jan said. Most of my work uses a race and gender analysis, and so this question is very close to how I think and what I choose to work on. Despite the decades-long fight for civil rights in this country, we are still a society that is largely stratified by race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, and that means that the norms that create the stratification and the stereotypes that come into play for each of those different groups shape the way that people do or don't have choices. Some people do have the right to choose to do this or that. Some people have much less choice. Some people have no choice at all. And it also changes the way, it affects the way that those technologies get used by or on people. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Sterilization. In the early 1970s, there was a fight by women's health advocates to increase access to sterilization so that women could choose not to have any more children than they already had. At the same time, sterilization was being used against particular populations in the United States against their will. So I mentioned, I think, before the practice of forced cesareans. There's also been a longstanding practice of forced sterilization in our country. Mm-hmm. And perhaps not surprisingly, right, the people who were chosen, they did not choose, but who were chosen, right, to undergo forced sterilization were those who were considered to be undesirables in our society. Since the early part of the 20th century, sterilization is being used in the name of eugenics in the United States. So in the early part of the century, it was persons who were considered to be disabled, but they use different terms now, terms I don't want to repeat right now. People who had what we now consider to be health problems, but were considered to have moral problems at that time. In the latter part of the 20th century, the rhetoric changed. It was no longer in the name of eugenics, but about people who were sort of creating other problems in other ways. So in California, well, maybe you've heard more recently, actually, that North Carolina, which had a eugenics program, North Carolina is actually having a serious discussion about not only apologizing to the victims of forced sterilization, but also paying reparations to the people who underwent forcible tubal ligations and vasectomies. Do you know which state performed more forced sterilizations than any other in the nation?
California.
Yeah, California. We've had an apology in this state, but we've had no further discussion about it, so maybe it's time for that. Not surprisingly, in North Carolina, the primary targets were African American women and men. California was largely Latinas, but also other women of color and low-income white women. as well. In the Northeast, during the same period of time, it was Puerto Ricans. In parts of the Midwest, it was low-income white women. So it's not always the same group, but it's often for the same kinds of reasons. So again, when you think about race and ethnicity, it's about how much of a real choice is there, and it's also about sort of who chooses or doesn't get to choose about how these different technologies are used.
Also, in Puerto Rico, about a third of women were sterilized using IUDs and other technologies as experiments, and many of the experiments did go on in teaching hospitals that are located in major urban areas where poor women and women of color exist, and not so much in Nevada County. However, this is the two-tiered medical system, too, and this is something that we have not gotten away from, and I'm afraid that we're looking at it, we're shining a light to it, but I'm not sure that the Accountable Care Act is going to remedy this problem, because we still have a health care system that's based on money and profit. And there will always be victims of it, and we haven't gotten very far when we talk about age and race and sex and ethnicity. And one of the things that has always confronted myself as a feminist and the women's health specialists is that we find ourselves in strange bedfellows with people that want to have abortion rights, but want to have it for different reasons than we do. For instance, there's people that think there's too many people in the world, and that's why women should have to have abortions, or there's too many poor people in the world, and that poor women that live in the city shouldn't have, they have too many children, and that's why we should have abortion, or women should be forced to be sterilized, or women should be using methods of birth control that in a better world they wouldn't even want. So these are the kinds of things that happen when we have the ills of our society that aren't being addressed. And I think as women, it's our responsibility, it's our world, and we're the ones that are going to change it.
I wanted to just expand on that question just a little more. I don't think it's just on race and ethnicity that impacts women's health, and also the issue of religion and where you come from, your community, your political affiliation. Those are all areas that impact women's health. Let me share something that I think that almost impacts every family. Before we used to go to a family reunion, my mother always used to say, don't talk about sex, politics, or religion. We all were kind of brought up with that. And those are the three subjects that now dominate every aspect of my life, especially women's health. And so why don't we get that guidance from our own families? Because we were told we're not supposed to talk about it. And why are we not supposed to talk about it? Because we're going to let others, we're going to let political parties or your political affiliation or your religious affiliations talk to you about that rather than your guidance from your own particular mother and father or your brothers and sisters having a conversation. Not that you always agree, but to have those conversations so that when you're at an age to vote, you can remember that this impacts not only me, but it impacts my sister and my mother and maybe the child that I'm going to have in the future. So all these decisions, we don't talk about them. That's why these forums are so valuable, because you put a real face to the issue that every day you're facing, or you should be, because every day somebody has decided that they're going in the media or in television or in some way or another make some money by having it on the front page of the newspaper. Right now, it's because it's an election year. We have both political parties using it. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just make these decisions, educated decisions, because you have obtain the guidance from people that are in this panel or others that you wish to obtain that guidance from and that educational policy, rather than for some article from somebody for their own political expedience that's decided to write an article about women's health.
I think, to piggyback on what you've all said, and we've talked, I've heard a few different things. Obviously, race and ethnicity is the focus of the question. Economics were brought up as well. Could we add into that dialogue issues of either further about economics, sexual orientation, geography, age? What are the impact of those so-called demographics on issues of women's health, be it access or any of the issues that you've been bringing up?
I'll start because, as some of you know, Nevada County is very rural and very spread out, and luckily the two main cities, Grass Valley and Nevada City, have much better transportation, although it's minimal, to be able to access our clinic, which we co-sponsor with Women's Health Specialists. And even something that's important and hopefully not needed often, the access to emergency contraception is difficult where we are because there are only 2 pharmacies that carry it, and if our clinic happens to be closed and you're not able to get an appointment at one of the other clinics that might possibly have the prescription, then you drive quite a ways in order to get it. I've been looking at some things online that say it's probably a good idea to have that prescription on hand, so just a word of advice. But in any case, the geography of our area really impacts the ability for young people to come to the clinic. It doesn't matter so much for the older people who usually have a car, but the fact is that at least there is a bus line that they can take. But when you think about how spread out, and this area is really urban compared to Nevada County, so think about the rest of the rural areas of California and how important clinics and satellite clinics like Women's Health Specialists and the Planned Parenthood offices are to help with reproductive health access. It's really important.
I'd like to piggyback on the Plan B idea, is that there's a very good paper that just came out from the Native American Resource Center in North Dakota, Sharon Asatoya, and one of the things that's happening with the Bureau of Indian Affairs is that the incidents of rape are not being prosecuted by the law enforcement, which is part of the dominant white culture. And one of the things, which is just a Band-Aid, but it's certainly helpful, is to have Plan B on hand at the Bureau of Indian Affairs clinics, which has been prohibited. And if you go to our website, we'll link you right to that. There's a very big voice of light being shed on this to have access to those services. I can't think of a more blatant example of how race, ethnicity, location, everything happens with this example. The other thing is that we've seen over the last decade or so the attack on young women, and I think this was particularly cruel. As a young woman myself, I had to face a decision to have an abortion when I was 16 years old. And I know what that is. I know what I had to go through. And I think it's one of the reasons why I do the work that I do today. And I think to not let young women get the support that they need for the decisions that they will have is unconscionable. And despite the fact that we've been able to defeat these propositions, they keep ruling their heads. And I think that the attacks are coming to the most vulnerable populations. And this is an injustice.
I want to talk a bit about Plan B and about the bigger picture frame. So, and young women, bringing it into perspective. Plan B is emergency contraceptive. So that means that you can take it up to 72 hours and prevent a pregnancy, okay? Back in July of last year, we had a long conversation because the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, had approved Plan B to be put on the shelves of pharmacies. So that meant that it would be accessible to women. Now, when Plan B was first developed, they created a new class of drugs for Plan B. That meant not necessarily a prescription, but it wouldn't be on the shelf. It would be behind the counter. Okay, so when this medication first came on, or this method of birth control, they created a new class. This is government and society impacting the access to it. Okay, and now that's not saying anything about how much it costs, because one dose of Plan B is about $50. So that means you have to have $50 in 72 hours to access this, right? So, as I said, back in July, the FDA had said we will approve Plan B to be put on the shelf in pharmacies. On December 7th or thereabout, the Health and Human Service Department overruled the FDA and said, no, it cannot go on the shelf. So this is how government intercepted an access or an option for a prevention service, birth control method. Now, why did the government do that? They did it as a compromise. They compromised because the Conference of Bishops were up at Capitol Hill talking to our congresspeople and talking to our senators about, we don't want this on the shelf, despite the fact that there was scientific evidence that said this is a safe, effective birth control method, though it was a little pricey.
Thank you for fleshing that out.
Thank you. We've touched on a little bit of this, but to go a little bit further, what are the long-term impacts of having access, or rather not having access, to preventative health care for women? We've mentioned a couple of them, certainly emergency contraception, as you've just spoken to, but also issues of pap smears, breast health screenings, birth control, mammograms, so forth. The long-term impacts.
Well, at Planned Parenthood, as you know, we do the pap smears, we do the educational programs, we check for STIs. And for those women that don't have health insurance, that are not part of Family PAC, that are not able to come to our clinics and not be screened or checked out or have their annual examination, it could be a very devastating and actually life and death decisions that have to occur in those families. I don't know of a family in any community now that is impacted by someone dying from cancer. And it's absolutely devastating when you hear of these young women with small families that are dying because they didn't get checked, because they didn't have life insurance, or health insurance. Or they didn't have the time to go to a clinic because they didn't have the child care, or they didn't have the transportation needs. I have heard people say, oh, that can't be true, that can't happen. Everybody can afford to get to a clinic. No, everybody can't afford to get to a clinic. You've just heard members on this panel allude to the fact that transportation is always not accessible. Many of you know how hard it is sometimes to be traveling with children. And let me take it another step further. To go into a clinic where someone doesn't speak your language is very intimidating also. When I was in the legislature, we fought very hard to make sure that when you're going to a health clinic, that someone that speaks your language deals with you. Because when somebody tells you that you have cancer, or you're going to have follow-up treatment, or that you have a lump on your breast, you would like to have some compassionate caregiver give you some sometimes very difficult use to take in a language that you're accustomed to. So every time there's a story, let me tell you, there's hundreds following it. So I'm a believer about sitting down, and many of us just sitting and listening to the stories of our neighbors, stories of our family members, because you will always hear a story that impacts women's health and family health.
All of the women's health issues, cervical cancer, STIs, STDs, all of these are completely preventable. And if we lived in a world, in a society where we would extend those preventative screenings to all, we wouldn't need to be talking about this. So why don't we have that? Certainly, this panel wants to see that, and I think everyone in this room would want to see that. There's social barriers. The fact that Plan B costs $50 is infuriating. I mean, if you look at our defense budget, and then you think about why couldn't we give out Plan B for free, you have to start questioning what kind of a healthcare system do we have. And I think that as long as we have a system that's based on corporate decision-making, two things are going to happen. One, we're going to have inequality to access to these preventative services, and we're also going to be exposed to experiments on the part of medical corporations. If you've just read, the technology in pap smears has really changed. And one of the things about having clinics is that we are going to stay on top of this, and we are going to shed light on things that we should do and be cognizant of. One of the things about the pap smear is they're realizing that maybe they've gone too far with their industry, and it would be better to pull back a bit because we are over-medicating and over-servicing women that are being coming up with positive risk factors that don't really exist. So I think that as long as we've got a system that is off kilter, we're going to have to be the voice of conscience and reason.
Thank you.
I want to weigh in on that.
And then I get a turn.
Okay. I have a friend who just died of cervical cancer. She was 38 years old. So the answer to the question is, if we don't have preventive health services, we will have death and dying.
Yep.
And it's as simple as that. Cervical cancer is so treatable. It is one of the cancers that they say is curable. And the test for cervical cancer is a pap test. So this woman did not need to die. If we don't have prevention, the two-tiered healthcare system that we have in place will continue to divide. It will continue to create a population that has no access, so they have what I call excess death and excess sickness. And it will continue to create a population that has access, on the other hand, and in a healthier community. So which one do you fall in? And at what point could you find yourself in the one you thought you didn't fall in? The main reason that people file for bankruptcy in this country is because they had a major health catastrophe. So people who thought they were okay, who thought they had insurance, who thought they had enough money, they find themselves on the other side of that road, trying to figure out if there's a public system that will take care of them. And now we have an ailing public system that really does not want to do preventive health.
Thank you. Sharon, you want to say?
And so there's your responsibility for all of the people in this room as well as those up here. Our community is healthy because we're healthy. And when you're in a situation where you're finding that you're not healthy, whether it's an STI or an unexpected and unplanned pregnancy, that's going to impact not only you, but your community. And I'm finally pretty good on Facebook, so I want all of you that are online 24/7, take a look at the MTV Get Yourself Tested. Take a look at, Rock the Vote is still out there, believe it or not. And the Bedside or RH Reality Check. There's so many resources. You get to be maybe the leader in the people that, read your posts and that you're tweeting to, whichever. Bottom line, your health means our health and our whole community, the workforce. Why are you here in school? Think about the impact it would have if you weren't healthy. And not being healthy is as simple a thing as not being tested. Get yourself tested.
Thank you. And as we get closer to our Q&A portion, I want to remind everybody to fill out their cards, and our Puente students will be going through the audience collecting those. Thank you very much for all of your insights. Moving us forward a little bit, we are seeing an apparent shift in the definitions of body sovereignty and the constitutional right to privacy. How do you see these impacting reproductive rights today and in the future? I'll just do a little side note to that question. This may be an area that we do want to delve into, abortion and the issues of legality around abortion, certainly because right to privacy is what was extended to help legalize abortion access. Any one of you?
You want to go
Doctor?
on?
Okay.
When I first was confronted with having an unwanted pregnancy, I realized that I had a big decision to make, and it was one that was going to affect my life. And I often look, and I've spoken with thousands and thousands of women over the last 35 years, and I know where they come from and where they're going to go. And what I have known to be true is that women are in the best decision-making position, and that if they are not, then it will be someone else that decides. And that is not just. A government that can take away a choice can force women to be sterilized, to have abortions, just as easily as they can take away the right to have it. And without those basic rights, we won't be able to raise our children to realize their full potential. It doesn't matter if you ever have an abortion, and it doesn't matter if you like it or don't like it. It just simply doesn't matter. It's really, as a society, what we are going to value in ourselves and our families. So once you start looking at the picture, we have to look at women as the nurturers of our society, of our families, and give them the reasonable support and power that they need.
Oh, she's at it again.
Go ahead. All right. I'm going to put this in a slightly bigger picture, I think, or a slightly bigger framework. One is that the fight for civil rights in the 1960s and 70s, which include the fight for the right to choose, were based on very deep notions, very big notions of autonomy, and the idea that each person should have the right to decide to what happens to their own body. Because your body is the last line between you and the state, and between you and the rest of the world, so shouldn't you have the right to at least rule over that one portion of society? And I think two things have happened in the meantime. So one is that notion of autonomy has been separated from the ultimate quest, which was for equality. The fight for autonomy with respect to women was about fighting for gender equality, and the fight for autonomy with respect to communities of color was about racial equality. And in the meantime, what's happened is it's become something more like free market individualism. That choice is something that we get by buying it, something that we get in the market. And that's related to the second point I wanted to make, is that a large part of what's happened to the body is it's become commercialized in the past few decades, largely through the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. And so a large part of what you need for your health or what you don't need for your health is available for purchase. And if you can't purchase it, either because you don't have health insurance or you don't have disposable income or credit, then you can't get it. You can't get health, and you don't get those choices or those decisions to make about your own body. So again, I'm going to speak in big terms. We can go to more specific examples if you want. And I know Jan wanted to speak as well.
I wanted to talk about history and the history of African American and black women in this country. So in 1619, the first slave ship arrived here. It was called Jesus. And we did not have autonomy or self-determination over our bodies. There were other groups of people who were enslaved also. There were ones who were marched a Trail of Tears and put on reservations and did not have autonomy or control over their bodies. So the notion of having self-determination is an extremely important one in communities of color, because for so long we had been enslaved, if not physically, then economically and financially. So it is an important factor to bring up in terms of, if I don't control my body, who will? And if someone else controls my body, what can they do with it? How will they exploit it? Will they exploit it in the media? For Black women, our media images were always one of always available. We were that sapphire. We were the whore, you know, in media. We were always almost available. So when we start wanting to control our bodies, then they created this angry Black woman image of us, which they still do. So it is extremely important to be able to have control over your body and your autonomy and what happens with your body.
In our society, you talked about the commercial part of it. And, you know, I wrote some legislation regarding being able to have a mammogram and then go to back home when you and your doctor decided, rather than an insurance company telling you when you should be able to get back. And when I was moving that piece of legislation through, I used to always make speeches about, isn't it interesting how every tire and car and rug in the United States and just about everything else is sold based on a woman's cleavage, and how great you look in the front of a magazine with your breasts popping out, and how much money is made in America based on a woman's body. But heaven forbid that those breasts have cancer. Heaven forbid that that woman, any part of that woman's body, has cancers or dysfunctional or having a problem, because then our society pushes you away. And then all of a sudden they have their rights. They have a right to tell you what to do with it. Because they'll say, well, we're paying for it. So that's when the economics comes into it again. So they control our bodies 100%. So it's so important that all of these decisions are made not by just one gender or one ethnicity, but by the people that it represents, that we're inclusive, that the laws and the decisions and the policies are made by people that understand what my body is all about, what my religion's all about, what it is to be a Latina in this country, to be a Roman Catholic. I want those decisions made by people that understand who I am, not by people, not by Roman Catholic bishops who have never had a child. So those are the discussions that all of you need to participate in after you leave this site, to continue those dialogues, because they're facing you each and every day.
Thank you. You all have given us quite a bit to think about and to talk about and dialogue about, which was the hope that I had for today. So as those Q&A cards are finishing coming in, let me ask you one last question before we move on to Q&A. And that question is, given all that you've been bringing to us today and the wide variety of issues of women's health, what recommendations for action do you have for those that are interested in either A, being better informed consumers in the healthcare system, or B, working to protect women's reproductive justice, or C, a combination of both of those things?
Volunteer and vote.
That's good. Concise.
And educate yourself and read.
Okay, I was like, after you vote, then hold your elected official accountable. Show up at their office, ask them what they're doing, give them a report card, because we cannot simply afford to just vote and go away.
And while voting is essential. It's an individual act, and what we need to do is act together. And there's many, many ways to get involved. There's the internet is wonderful, but it's also very when you look at women's health on the internet, you will be inundated with pharmaceutical companies and all kinds of dialogues that really aren't about grassroots women and our activities. So I would encourage you to look at the websites of the women that are represented here, and that will lead you to others, and get involved in that way. There's many, many ways to get involved in women's reproductive health and justice. And as a group of women, we can accomplish much.
In addition to what everyone said, I would say tell your stories, because each and every one of you have a story, your own personal story. You've seen your sister, or your mother, or your grandmother, an aunt, every single one of you. Young men, speak up for your sisters. Speak up, because a lot of us sometimes are embarrassed or frightened or don't know what to say, and say, you know, I know someone who's gone through this, but I don't know how people are going to accept it. Speak up, tell your stories. Those are the most powerful tool that you have. When you speak from your heart, when you speak from your voice, when everybody speaks from the same common denominator, it always comes to telling the truth.
And I would add to that, for those of you, I work in law, and I'm always telling people to work against the law. So you have to speak to power. You have to speak to power. You do have to vote. You have to get out there and vote. You have to support the legislatures who are doing a good job, but sometimes you need to speak back. And so for those of you who are activists, and I know many of you out there are activists, and you're going to be leaders, and you are currently leading different aspects of our society. You can go back to what Jan was talking about when she talked about we have 3 different frameworks in the movement right now. Reproductive rights, reproductive health, and reproductive justice. And if this is the issue, these are the set of issues that grab you, you can think about which of those 3 frameworks sort of really speaks to you. You want to focus on the legal approaches, and you can think of yourself and position yourself as a reproductive rights advocate. For those of you who are really focused on and really want to think about helping women directly, increasing access to services, and you can get involved as a reproductive health activist. For those of you who want to work at the community level and organize and think about the long-term social changes that we need, you can work from the reproductive justice perspective and get involved with those organizations. There's a lot of activity going out there, so there's a lot to contribute to.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Where have you been all my life?
Okay, so as we move into the Q&A portion, and as promised, we have about 20 minutes left. Let me remind you to be courteous and respectful during this process. I know that Q&A time periods tend to want to lend themselves to everybody talking at once, and for this to be effective, let's try to keep a little bit of order to what we're doing. I do have a number of cards, and there may be more coming in. I'm going to read these questions as written. They're not my words. They're the questions coming up on, coming to me from you all. So I'm going to read them verbatim. And our first question is, scientific fact, not emotion and not personal perspective, tells us that a new human being is created at conception. Therefore, why do we have the right to kill that human being whom we can all see by ultrasound and who has a heartbeat at 21 days of life?
I can speak to that.
Okay.
I think I did speak to this. And it is, a woman knows exactly what her body's doing. And a woman knows when she's pregnant that she has a life inside her. And it is not through ignorance or risk that, or just not taking our lives seriously, that we come to the decisions that we come to. And as I work in reproductive justice and reproductive health, the only thing that ever makes sense to me is to look at the woman in the picture. And that drives my That's my guidance. And women know what abortion is. I don't think anybody should push it under the rug. It is a life that is stamped out. However, sometimes desperate times are desperate measures. One of the things that I met Catholics for a Free Choice years and years ago, and they're still around today. And one of the sisters, Mary McGuire, used to come around the country and talk about Catholics for a Free Choice, recognizing that even though many Catholic women have abortions, many are too embarrassed or scared to say. So she was trying to represent those that didn't feel comfortable coming out. And she said that life begins when you want to have a baby. And, you know, I really thought about that. And I've watched women that come to our clinic to figure out when to get pregnant, how they can get pregnant, and they are full of life. And I've watched women come into our clinic when they can't be pregnant. And that is what we look at, and that's what guides my life.
Taking the tough one, Ms. Donna. Thank you.
Anybody else want to talk to that, or should we move?
Well, I just wanted to add that it is about quality of life, too. And that when people ask those questions, they always make the assumption that it's just an easy decision to make. And I have never, ever heard of someone that has had an abortion say that it was an easy decision. And the realm of reasons is huge about why. It's because the doctor suggested it. It's because she can't afford it. She has 5 other children. It's because her husband's an alcoholic. It's because it goes on and on and on. It's because she's dying, and she really doesn't think she could care for another child, and she doesn't know where this child's going to go. So again, it's not an easy decision, and so we need to be more respectful. When we talk about respectful, it's respectful of the choices. It's beyond having a right. It's about being respectful of us as human beings and as women, to understand that every woman knows what her body is telling her and what she is going through. And for me, on a very personal, it's always very difficult when a man's telling me the decisions that I have to make with my body until he's been through it. I'm sorry, you don't have any right to tell me what's going on.
Okay, next question. Does abortion cause or increase your risk for breast cancer?
The short answer is no, it does not.
How about all together now? All together now.
But I
1, 2,
think
3.
that-
No.
But I think that you can do your own research, and I would go to Guttmacher Institute or many other that work in the reproductive field. And I know that this is a controversy that has been kept alive. I don't think it's worthy of keeping alive. I also will tell you that it doesn't dissuade a woman from having an abortion. A woman, if back before abortion was legal, women would rather die than bring another child into the world. And women did die, and women do die in this world because of unsafe abortion. So if you think that women are going to get dissuaded because of a breast cancer scare, I can tell you that our lives are so much more serious, and that it's not a winning strategy to outlaw abortion.
Just one
Oh, go ahead.
quick thing. And then I'll let you
No,
get
go
to it.
ahead.
I was going to say,
might
at
say what
our
I wanna say.
organization, Black Women for Wellness, we have a breast health program called Keep in Touch. And this is a program where we teach women how to do a breast self-exam. We counsel women with how to get the most out of a well woman exam. And we also look at the statistics of how breast cancer is impacting our lives. And African American women have the highest breast cancer mortality, meaning that we die the most from breast cancer. If you look at the average group of women who have breast cancer, you will find that 5 years later, African American women are more likely to have died from the breast cancer than other women. So when we talk to our breast cancer survivors about the choices that they have made, about the children that they have had, abortion is never factored in, in how they are treating their breast cancer or addressing their breast cancer. When you are looking at breast cancer and looking at why me, abortion does not come up. The number of children you have does not come up, because that factor, the number of children you have or don't have, the number of pregnancies you've had or didn't have, is not in your why me conversation around breast cancer.
Dr. Akimoto, do you want to?
I think I would repeat what Shauna said, is that the question about a link between abortion and breast cancer has been raised in a particular context, and it's important that you find out for yourself. And that's really at bottom what this is about, is that it's about access. It's about the fact that everybody should have access to the accurate information to be able to make the decision for themselves. I think it's interesting that the questions that are framed in opposition to abortion are now being framed in terms of science. So the question is it scientific fact that life begins at conception, right? Or the link between abortion and breast cancer is framed as science. And that's part of a trend that's been happening recently, is that what for many people, abortion is many things. For some people it's just sort of, it's a very hard practical reality that some people have to think hard about whether or not they need to terminate their pregnancy. For some people it is a medical question. It's about a threat to their lives or to their health. For other people it's a deeply moral question, and we live in a society which should protect the deeply moral question that each person faces when they make any kind of medical decision, and they should be able to make it for themselves. But the way that sort of the opposition to abortion, the moral opposition to abortion, is now being medicalized, is being framed in science terms. It's a ploy, right, to take away the moral decision that each and every person should be able to make for themselves.
Here's our next question. What necessarily causes insurances to cover Viagra for men but not birth control for women?
Fewer women in leadership.
Did we mention sexism? I don't know if we ever did, but that's alive and well in the United States.
Amen.
It's basically because they can. They could do it, so they're going to do it, and they just assume women are not going to fight back. But guess what? I think in November we're going to show them.
That's right.
Okay, our next card reads, thank you for coming. Does a lack of insurance affect a woman's access to women's resources, or how much access to resources does a woman without insurance have? Where can we find such, if or any, resources? So I think some of this has probably been covered earlier, but maybe that last part of it about
Well,
where do we go?
Yes, you can always go to Planned Parenthood. We have educational programs. Get on the internet or pick up the phone, call one of our clinics. We're always involved in the community. Call somebody in the schools now. Some of them have, again, educational programs. call people, reach out, talk to one another. There's a lot of resources available. We try to provide the access to all people who need it, but of course, low income come to us, people who don't normally have the access, and we're trying to make ourselves available in the rural areas. But it's important to have the education, and to have the education that is accurate information, not just something that was given to you at, one place. Do your homework, compare information. Only you know the answers for your particular family, your situation, but we work very hard to make access available for all in various forms. If it is making sure that we have enough clinicians and educated people in our clinics, to have enough educators out in the community to teach our teenagers and our young mothers how to prevent further pregnancies and how to take care of herself and to take care of her health and the health of her child.
I've just been noticing that not everyone in the room is younger than I. So some of you remember President Nixon. And so for all his flaws or perceived flaws, he also was part of the decision to start Title X, which is the wonderful contribution toward reproductive health care for uninsured and underinsured people of reproductive age. And Title X is under attack in Congress. And while it's still it's still active, I want you to please know that Family Pact is available, and if you go to a women's health clinic or women's health specialist clinic or Planned Parenthood or other community clinics, you will almost always qualify if you are uninsured or underinsured and you are a reproductive age. So Title X, pay attention and make sure that it does not ever stop.
I think, Shauna, this is a great time for you to do a commercial for women's health specialists, because
Amen.
we're here in Northern California,
That's
and your
right.
clinic provides services.
Well, absolutely. And, we also see ourselves as a place that you can go and get health information or call us on the phone and get health information, whether you come into our clinics or not. We do have 4 clinics in Northern California and 3 or 4 satellites. But women's health information, women are starved for it. We understand that. And as I mentioned before, it's hard to get accurate information that's not driven by corporate medicine or pharmaceutical companies. So go to your trusted sources and start with us.
I would just add 50 million people in this country are uninsured, and many, many more million people are underinsured. So they have some form of public or private insurance, but they still don't have enough coverage to enable them to get full access health care. So yes, we have a wide network of clinics that people can access, and those are vital. They're safety nets for society, but that still means that millions of people are not getting access to health care. And as Jan said earlier, that means lives.
And they're being threatened every day. As you know, we have so many candidates out there that are saying that one of the first acts that they're going to do is defund Planned Parenthood.
Yeah.
So it's nothing that we could take for granted. And, many of you have been born in an age where they had clinics available in your communities. But that's not something we could take for granted because, around the corner that we might all be gone or not be here.
There are clinics closing today.
Yeah.
And every month there has been something in the Congress and something therefore in the news about funding. So this is a point where you can take some action. If you are, how many of you all are on the internet?
Not hardly.
So one place where you can find access to resources, a plethora of resources, is California Family Health Council. Okay? Our organization, Black Women for Wellness, you can like us on Facebook, or you can find us on the internet also. Sometimes we put resources up there, but when we don't, you can call us and ask for one or go visit our website. Right now we have a campaign where we have pictures of folks in their hoodies. But that's one way you can stay in tune in terms of look on the internet and then cross-reference that, because there are a lot of clinics that are not clinics who are perpetrating as clinics in our communities also. They call themselves crisis pregnancy clinics, but really the point of it is to delay you and not give you the treatment and care that you deserve until they can achieve their political point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, given the fact that today's event was to look at a wide array of women's health issues and to look at the questions of access, and given that we are just about at 2 o'clock, I think these are great notes to end on. I don't know about all of you, but I could listen to our panel all day, so thank you very much
So
for
can
coming,
we.
sharing your expertise. And thank you all for joining us today. Just a reminder, there are a couple more Love Your Body Week events this afternoon. Please join in and love your body the rest of the week.